Now that this set is safe to work on, let's come back to this edge and just giving it a little tickle and a dab, and that's neatened that. And likewise, if I turn this so that I've got the tip of the brush pointing in the right direction, giving that a little scrub so it tidies up, but it also allows me to lift a small amount of paint, and I'm just blending that back in, so it gives it that little reflected shine along its edge. Okay, now it's time to work on the petals, and I'm going to start with this inner skirt. So I'll wet, and of course there's a little bit of tint on my brush from the previous bit of work, so I can see what I'm doing, and then just taking my very soft blue, which is tinted slightly green, I'm just running it in along these edges where the outer petal would shade this little skirt. And if I just touch it at the top, I may be able to tease a little bit of the green from the cap at the top. Just gives it a little bit of unity. Okay, so that will tuck it back behind these two outer wing petals. Okay, and while I'm waiting for that to dry a little bit, I can wet, not up against this edge, but just wet the petal, and then again with very, very watery blue, adding in a little bit of shading down here. And also in this area there's a little bit of a shadow. Now that looks a bit strong, so I'll just nudge it with a bit of water. Don't want a hard line there, soften that up. And there are little veins, little sort of creases. If we can get them in very, very pale, it'll be realistic. But we don't want to cover up this beautiful white flower with too much paint. Just enough to show that we've observed the way it works. Now this is still marginally damp, so I'm going to use this moment to put in the markings. So fairly thick paint, quite a yellowy green, and why I'm saying fairly thick paint is that this is damp. If it were dry, I would not use, I would use, whoops, that's actually a bit dark. So let's get more yellow in, that's better. So if it goes onto this just slightly damp surface, it'll have soft edges. Okay, we need that to dry before we can do the adjacent petal. Just softening that line. And then we come to this outer petal. Again, wetting it. And going to that blue, which has just the slightest bit of yellow in, so it's a greeny blue rather than a pure blue. And then we bring in some shading here. There's a little more shading on this right hand petal because it's in the shadow of this part and it's not catching the light the way this petal would. But again, not too much, because otherwise we're going to end up with a blue flower rather than a white flower with a bit of shading on. And again, I'm going to run a few little streaks, just enough to show that I've observed the way it works. Okay, and as soon as this is dry, I can can paint the underneath one, but in the meantime this is looking rather stark. So with that pale blue, I'm just giving that the slightest bit of tint. This is quite a translucent part of the flower, so you kind of want to indicate that you can see through it. It's picking up what's behind it. Okay, and when this is dry, then we can wet the petal at the back. Now with this one, I'm up against this dark blue, and because this is further back, I could make it slightly out of focus by just tickling that edge, which will soften it. And you see a bit of that blue is seeping back in, which is nice. And then having wet that, I'm going to put a bit of blue into that. Again, it's a greeny blue. It's not pure blue. And this one's going to be darker. There, where it casts a shadow. And then I'll just draw that over. So it definitely is the petal at the back. The edge has gone slightly ragged, so I can tidy that. And then I have a petal there, the other side of this little skirt part, which needs to be shaded as soon as this is dry. And all I'm going to do is pick a slightly darker shade of this to run in along here and soften it down with water. But that will need a few moments. Got a slightly untidy bit there, so I'm just going to tickle that with a damp brush, and that will actually tidy up that shape. And here where you've got your background wash that's come up to the petal, you may have a little bit of raggedness. So again, just with the tip of a brush that's not too soft, the slightest little tickle will soften it and tidy it at the same time. That I feel is again a bit harsh where the paint has settled up against the white. So again, because I like to point the brush towards where I'm working, giving that just a little tickle. I'm not lifting paint off, I'm just redistributing it really. And that's also softened this petal so that it doesn't look like it's just been cut out and stuck on. There we go. And let's see if we can get in there with that shadow there. Sometimes you can see a green marking on this underskirt if the angle is right. But really, that's it. A solitary snowdrop painted. I want a little bit more colour on here. Done.